Okay, I'm going to be talking about a thesis I wrote. This talk is called A Conceptual Model of Bleed, and I will be introducing three concepts that are novel. One is the bleed perception threshold, the other is the relational matrix of bleed, and the third is a type of bleed that I have called identity bleed. Now, in the undying words of Jack Black, frontman in the well-known band Tenacious D, this is not the greatest song in the world. This is just a tribute. And I hope you understand that when I have to cover a lot of ground really fast. So a lot of the things that I seemingly just cover very, very quickly are covered in more detail in my thesis. And the thesis is called Bleed and Identity, a conceptual model of bleed, and how bleed out from role-playing games can affect a player's sense of self. This thesis is an attempt at a roadmap because it moves into territory that has not really been charted that much. And so it's aimed at connecting the role-playing and this particular the phenomenon of bleed to already established theories of identity creation. And we have to talk a little bit about that last part before we get into the concept. Because identity creation is not something that is new. And we can go back all the way to 1890 with James, the first person to really, maybe not the first person to suggest it, but after James, there's a more of a agreement that identity is not a one thing, it's not a completely one fixed thing. We all have a multiplicity of identities or aspects that combine into our sense of self, who we feel that we are. And this person's sense of self is then deeply connected to the enactment of these identities in social settings and frames. You can see all the people who agree with me, more or less, referenced here. Just to make it very short, the thesis it goes into, it's a selection because this field is very big. So in the thesis, my selection of established theories of identity creation that I try to make connections to, they are, among others, Erikson's theory of stages of social development, Marcia's theory of identity achievement, Jung's theory of self in the process of individuation, self-concepts and self-schemas following Piaget's theory of cognitive development. That is the psychology part and social psychology. I make some connections towards Stryker's identity theory and what was later known as self-presentation theory, although Goffman talked about it already back in the 50s. Also, a little bit of movement into neuroscience because I come from the nature sciences. I have a bachelor's degree in nature science, believe it or not. And so a lot of the issues with conscience and consciousness and identity is how do we even, right? And then how do we connect it to the harder sciences where things are observational and stuff like that. So I'm going into memory construction, processing, and recollection in my thesis. But as I said, this is not the greatest song in the world. This is just a tribute, so we're not going to spend too much time on it. Other than to say that this understanding that role-playing games have the potential to change our sense of self, it seems to be gaining ground. When I didn't graduate from theater school back in the late 90s, I came out of the Scottish theater school and was like, I'm seeking something else. Theater is a good thing. I seek something else and I don't know where to find it. At that point, there wasn't really that much to find. Now, had I been born 20 years later and gone out of school today, there are several theorists I probably would have found really interesting. And you can see some of them here. And the way, when it comes to the sense of self, pointing to bleed as one of the central ways in which players are affected by our experiences is not something new either. It goes all the way back to 2007, where Emily Care-Boss first used it in the discourse at Ropecon, the Finnish role-playing festival. And for those who now are wondering what even is bleed, this is a fairly educated group of people, but I will very quickly cover it too. Bleed is simply said aspects of the player spilling over to the character or vice versa. And then there's a whole host of subtypes that have been named. Emotional bleed, which is emotional states and feelings. Ego bleed, Wittgenstein's Beltrán talks about archetypal qualities and identity patterns that bleed. Procedural bleed and mimetic bleed, my own 2 small claims to fame in the field. And then relationship bleed, where very often romantic bleed, like you fall in love, your character falls in love with another character. Are you falling in love with that player? I don't know what's happening. Oh my God, please come help me. It's not just romantic bleed. Any sort of relationship might bleed. Parental, children, whatever it is. It's not described as much, and I think there are reasons for that. And then, of course, one of the most important contributions, I would say, Kemper, who talks about emancipatory bleed, where players from marginalized backgrounds experience liberation from that marginalization through their characters, actually wielding bleed as a tool more than just being subjected to the phenomenon. Now, my case for making a conceptual model of bleed, if it's not obvious, I think that there's a lot of different iterations of what is bleed, how does bleed work, but and the reason for that, I think, is that it's been helpful. Like, we wouldn't be talking about something in discourse if it wasn't helpful to bring the discourse forward. But I also think it's still very nebulous because we are not really good. We haven't been too good at connecting these different types of bleed and what is actually happening. And is there an overlap here? Maybe this theory is talking about this type of bleed is actually quite similar to this. Might there be an overlap? Might there be completely different? And I think that this lack of specificity has first of all led to the everyday use. I don't know about you, but and this is a very personal experience. This is no research behind this, but I feel when I talk with players about their experiences and they talk about bleed, they very often are talking specifically about emotional bleed, even to the point where, like, hey, what is bleed? And they will explain to you, oh, that's when your feelings and your emotions spill between player and character. It's not wrong, but it's a very specific subtype of bleed. And also, I think that it's also been, because of the lack of specificity, it's perceived as less useful in discourse, because in academic discourse, specificity is something you need. You want to completely just pull things apart and find that one little thing you can say something about, and then brings the discourse forward. Then, as long as this remains, then I think that these 2 challenges will also remain. And that is why I figured out I can make a first start of the roadmap. Doesn't have to be correct, doesn't have to be very detailed. It's a first step. Hopefully others will find that useful and come and correct me in the years to come. So, to the concepts that I'm actually going to talk about. The first challenge when studying bleed is that it's a subjectively experienced and self-reported phenomenon. Now, what does that mean? It means that if I want to study bleed and get some sort of data on it, I first need the players to experience bleed. I need them to recognize that what they're experiencing is bleed, and I need them to report it, right? And that in itself will lead to data being very skewed by the time it gets to you as a researcher, even if you actively go out and try to find this data. And also, this self-reporting, self-experiencing, subjectively experienced thing also leads to there being players even identifying across the spectrum. I first came really into thinking more about bleed back in 2017 when I did a workshop with Just Hansen at Knutpunkt. He came to me and said, Kjell, how do we bleed? I've never bled. And I'm like, first of all, wrong. But yes, this is interesting. And so we held a workshop and we called it To Bleed or Not to Bleed. 5 years ago, I was a little bit more pompous, I would say. No, but what we realized having that workshop was that it was a lot of people came to us and like, hey, this is something we're experiencing. We don't really understand what these other players are experiencing because we're not. But my proposition is that, and once again, in this thesis, I see that mechanics of bleed are closely connected to what is considered very universal processes of human identity creation, which leads me to think maybe it's not the fact that they're not experiencing it that is the issue here. Maybe it's just the fact that they're not recognizing that they're experiencing bleed. And that led me to suggesting what I've called the bleed perception threshold. And in this graph, very rudimentary graph, but my point is that the bleed experience will vary in intensity. Before the game, that has been also described by theorists, during the game and after the game. But at the same time, our threshold for perceiving that what we are experiencing is bleed is also changing all the time. Now, in this here example, you can, for instance, see it's very bad, the colors, at least on that screen. The blue line is the bleed experience, while the black line is the perception threshold. In this given case, this person would be experiencing bleed throughout, before, during, and after the event, but it would not be noticeable to them until this blue line crosses the black line some time after the start of the event. Oh, I'm bleeding. Okay, I'm experiencing that. The intensity of the bleed is higher than my threshold for perceiving it. And then towards the end of the game, it goes under again, not perceivable. And then after the game, at some point, oh, all of a sudden I'm experiencing bleed again. Now, further work will, I've already done some theorizing on what could influence this threshold. I would say, for instance, physical things like lack of sleep, lack of eating, stuff like that would probably lower the perception threshold because you have less of your identity defenses up, you have less of your energy up to like keep your sense of self rigid and who you are. And I would also say that different events have different intensity, right? Some events are intentionally designed to facilitate for transformative bleed experiences and so on, but then also everyone is different. So my bleed perception threshold in any given situation can be fluctuating, but it will also be fluctuating differently than, say, Finn's perception threshold. It's all very fluid. Now, this is a theoretical idea. So how you measure it, I have no idea, but that would probably, hopefully, be somebody who has at some point in the discourse. So the next challenge, when we just, now we have a term, how to talk about the presence or the absence of bleed. The next challenge is figuring out how it all fits together. What I can say now is that Google Slides does not fit together with PowerPoint because they're completely messed up. The point is, what I've tried to do, and once again, bear in mind, it's a theoretical model and it's a relational matrix, which means I'm suggesting that there might be, although probably quite nebulous, and the boundaries and borders of these different definitions might not be set in stone, but there are different areas and different types of bleed and how they function together. The first step I do is I try to identify what I call basic bleed components, and then the higher bleed complexes. 1 minute upside down. Okay, I'll be very quick then. It's exactly what it sounds like. Basic bleed components are the building blocks that together can make more complex bleed experiences. This is also just a suggestion at a figure to show how it all fits together. We can see here, for instance, a case of emancipatory bleed, which is a higher bleed complex, can have parts emotional bleed. It can have some parts ego bleed. It can have some parts mimetic and some parts procedural bleed. So any one of these, and these are the ones that have been described so far, 3, but there are potentially numerous different types of bleed complexes. I would say defining them should only stop where it's no longer useful to define this very specific type of bleed experience. So for instance, emancipatory bleed, very useful, clearly very useful. And to add to that, I have added my own complex called identity bleed. Now this, it steps a little bit on the feet of ego bleed and witness to Beltrán's wonderful work there, but Strix is very specific about exactly what ego bleed is. I would say identity bleed has ego bleed in it, but also other things that go towards sense of self and identity creation. So it becomes more of a complex. Now, I would argue ego bleed is a big part of that complex, but it's a little bit bigger than that. Here are some of the references I've used in this talk. I'm keeping up for a couple of seconds, so you can pause your video, somewhere in the future. Some more references, because this is a very well-referenced field. And thank you so much for your attention.